My name is Lauren Stroh, for those of you who don't know me. I'm delighted to be able to speak with you all today. This has been a difficult time for so many of us, and when I was asked to speak about grief and loss during this time, it's something that I feel is heavy on all of our hearts. Our minds are all processing really difficult things. I personally have had a really hard time transitioning to the screen, to teach, to be part of worship at church, to see my clients. It's been really, really difficult for me, and I feel it very acutely. And my heart is with everyone that's struggling, trying to teach over screens or teaching kids at home. We've really lost a lot. And there's a lot of collective loss that I think that we're able to grieve together, grieving all sorts of lost opportunities. Before I dive right in, a little bit about me. I work as a counselor at a private practice. I have all of my clients on telehealth right now, so I'm seeing all of them over the screen, processing that way, which definitely brings various degrees of difficulty to some of those experiences. I also am a musician. I play the organ and I sing and I direct the choir at an Episcopal church in Rockwall, Holy Trinity by the lake. I miss them so much right now. We are still doing church services over Zoom and Facebook Live, which has been really nice and in some ways a good learning experience, in many ways a good learning experience, but there is still that grief and that loss around being able to gather with the people that I love and hug them and cherish our time together and feel that energy that we have together. I say all of that because when I was looking up grief, not even grief, I Googled how to be healthy, grounded, how to find a healthy headspace during this time. And it was sort of inspired by a blog that I was asked to write for an organization about how do you find a healthy headspace right now. And I found all these lovely articles with tidy little bullet points of be positive, eat healthy, take walks every day. Those things are great. I'm not saying that I don't recommend them, but it's difficult to find ways in which to get positive if we haven't already dealt with some of the grief that we are dealing with. And I think it's easy to want to push things down. We're all still uncertain. We don't know what's coming up next. It's scary to say, I'm hurting here. This is hard for me. I miss this thing. I think something about that feels so real. We're stepping into a reality where we do not have control, where we are accepting what's actually going on. And it is so tempting to say, you know what, I'm maybe hurting, but I'm going to focus on the positives. I'm going to pretend that's not going on right now. And I'm just going to sort of hunker down until everything passes, which we still don't know when that's going to be. And I think it is a disservice to us, to ourselves, and to the people around us when we jump to that place of positivity when we're not yet there. And truly, some of this comes so much from my own experience. I want to see the good things all the time. I want everything to be a party. I want to show up and we all have energy and we're all happy. And recently that has not been the Lauren that I know. I've struggled a lot with depression and anxiety and difficulty with the screen time, a lot of exhaustion. And I do know that I'm not alone in that, because when I was able to name and identify some of that grief and some of that loss and some of the fears around this time, and take that to someone else, to safe people, they were able to mirror it back to me and say, I'm feeling this way too, and of course you're feeling that way. And almost magically, there's something that happens there where when you find that hurt within yourself and you can take it to God in prayer, take it to a friend, take it to your partner or even your kiddos, sit down with them. When you're able to do that, there's something really beautiful and magical that can happen. And I think what that is that you're starting to move through the grief to the you're getting closer to the acceptance, where just because we're accepting it does not mean that it will stay this way. It just means that there will be more peace around deciding there's nothing I can do right now with what's happening, and I don't like it, but that is my reality right now. And I do believe that that brings us closer to healing, closer to peace, closer to connecting with those around us. One thing I wanted to talk about briefly, I was really inspired by a podcast I started listening to at the beginning of the shelter in place. Brene Brown, I don't know if any of you would have heard of her. She's written a lot of books, and she talks about researching shame, which hit me kind of in a funny way at first, so it was unfamiliar to me. But there is really so much of her work that is absolutely positive and uplifting, even though it's about shame and it's sort of freedom from a lot of that. She, in her podcast, talks to a grief specialist, David Kessler. He actually was part of the work, I believe it was mostly his work, to try to incorporate a sixth step of grief after the acceptance. He found in his own personal life that making meaning was really important. And that was something that really struck me. And in my own losses and my other griefs in life, I think where I've really felt true acceptance and true inspiration even from some of the events surrounding the loss were in those moments of being able to make meaning and being able to sort through, what does this mean for me going forward? How did this color my life and my experience? And although that is something that I think is really wonderful as a place to be, many of us are probably not there yet. Maybe some of us are, and that's great. But I know for myself, I'm still really struggling with where I am mentally, physically, and I'm not ready to make meaning of it yet. That being said, the podcast is really, really insightful and beautiful, and it talks through the other stages of grief. And a couple things that also really struck me were that they talk about comparing grief. One humongous thing that just jumped out at me when they were discussing this over the podcast was oh my gosh, I'm forgetting her name. Brene Brown. She asked David Kessler, so there's this, we can all experience these really intense griefs. Do you think it's that really intense grief that creates the statistic where when a couple loses a child or something really intense like that, they tend to not be able to stay together, or that's very I guess the percentage goes up really, really high of divorce. And she asked, is that because the grief is just so intense that, it's just tearing them apart and they don't know how to name it, work through it. And he said, no, I don't think that's what the grief is. He actually lost a child himself. He said, I think what pulls people apart is the judgment of the other's suffering. And this is where it gets really interesting. I work with a lot of kids as a counselor, and I noticed that they are grieving. They're grieving the end of their school year. They're grieving missing their teachers. They're grieving their friendships. There's the sports that they play, the things that they normally do, and they are really hurting. This might be one of the biggest losses they've ever experienced. And I hear some dismissive language from parents or caregivers, certainly I'm sure without any intention of dismissing that pain, but saying things like, you know what, I'm sorry, but people are dying right now. Like, this is affecting people so much more than you complaining about not being able to go to school. And what's so difficult, I think, and even perhaps destructive about that, is that when we start to compare people's suffering or the way that they're expressing the suffering, it takes away everything from everyone, and there's no moving through it. There's a stuffing of it and a hardening of the heart to okay, this is too much. It doesn't measure up to what's happening. I'm overwhelmed. I can't deal with this. And it's hard right now. A lot of us don't have the same amount of space to offer one another. But if you can think about just different personalities in general. I mean, I am an extrovert. For me, not being around people is so difficult, and I don't get the energy that I normally get just from those interactions, the physically being with someone, absorbing some of what's happening for them. Some introverts that I talked to at the beginning of Shelter in Place, they might not have experienced it as acutely at the beginning, or just differently. But as things have progressed and gone on, I've heard from many of them that they're having similar experiences to what I had at the beginning. We all have different thresholds. We all have different losses. Some of us are actually losing people to COVID-19. And that brings so much trauma and grief and difficulty with it. But that is not to say that a child who is missing their best friend from school is not to be considered when you consider suffering. I use this analogy sometimes with, I hear this all the time actually with my clients. I think I do this too, but I will be hurting in a certain way, or someone has, I've lost something, and I say, oh, this is horrible, but at least this didn't happen. I don't have it as bad as this person, and I should be grateful, and there's like a lot of these feelings of guilt that sort of pull you back into, no, you shouldn't be hurting. You are not allowed to hurt, or you are not, somehow it's just not bleeding enough, emotionally, or to be worthy of hurt. And that is such a lie. I think that is what holds us back so often from healing, is that we dismiss our own pain, and we dismiss the pain of those around us if it doesn't make sense, or it doesn't measure up to what we think it should measure up to. And I use the analogy with clients a lot where it's, if you see someone who's broken their arm, are you going to decide they don't deserve to go to the hospital or to feel like they're in pain because someone else needs their leg amputated in a war zone or something like really horrific? No, you would say that is still a hurt. That is something that needs to be attended to, and it's got to be taken care of. It's got to be nurtured and healed and put into a space where it can heal. And that, I think, is something that we forget about with our emotions. Something I did more recently, after listening to this podcast, actually, it really helped me to identify that I was avoiding a lot of the things that I was missing. I set a timer on my phone for 3 minutes, I think, and I just wrote down everything I could think of that was hurting, everything I was missing, my yoga classes, my regular walks. I miss feeling healthy in my body. For me, that's a really major loss, is the connection that I had to yoga and how that helps me feel secure in my own skin. And yeah, missing church, missing seeing the people in community that I see, and missing a lot of trips that were canceled. I mean, big things, small things. I did lose a mentor to COVID-19, and that was an incredible loss. And all of this being said is, yes, it may feel overwhelming to look at that list of things, but when I started to bring those things to prayer, or to meditate on some of those things, to cry, to let myself cry. Sometimes I have to turn on a sad song in order to cry. I really have a hard time letting go of some of that emotion that just wants to flow through. I truly believe that. I feel like it wants to flow through so that you have more space for yourself and for others that may be relying on you. And so I jotted down these things. Another thing I think that can be very helpful right now is being in therapy, especially if you don't have another safe person to go to. I have a therapist. I have a counselor support group right now that's meeting on Zoom, and writing down those losses and bringing them to those safe spaces was so difficult, and also really wonderfully freeing. I mean, it's, in a sense, especially in the group, people were able to also chime in and say, oh, me too. But right now, if you have a good therapist or a counselor that's doing their own work, they're experiencing similar things. They're not outside of that realm of COVID. You know, they're within all of this, and so they can show up as humans who can hold space for you and also say, I get it, I understand. And actually, just to specify with safety, I think every person is probably different in what having a safe friend or a safe family member means to them. Certainly someone that's not going to be emotionally or physically abusive in any way is probably a pretty clear idea for most people. I mean, that seems just like it makes sense. But I think beyond that, with safety, there's a couple things I ask myself when I'm really hurting or really in pain, and that is, who of my friends, of the people that I love, who is able to sit with me in that hurt and say, that's tough, that's horrible, I feel that too, I'm so sorry, and not offer a solution. I know there's that pressure, like, especially I know when you're kids or when someone who's really vulnerable comes to you, to quickly jump to fixing the problem or trying to come up with a solution before just sitting in that pain with them, in that moment of, I'm so sorry, I know the pool still isn't open and that is really tough. You love to swim. And that's something that is the favorite part. That's your favorite part of summertime. And we don't know when that's going to happen or when that's going to open up. It's just an example. But, you know, it's instead of jumping into a reason why, well, we could, you know, look up something else to do. Or, and those things can happen. But by looking at the loss point blank and deciding this is worthy of being noted, intentionally being spoken and being shared. Those are the people I think of when I think of safety. And people that won't judge you for things that might seem, I don't know, like they're not worthy of being mourned or feeling losses. I think when you can find a safe person, I mean, that is so valuable. And just, I always will ask friends and family, if I feel like I know something that could help solution-wise. Do you want me to share my opinion? Do you want me to tell you what I think? Do you want me to try to help you come up with a solution? After we've already talked about what we're feeling, what's hurting, that first and foremost needs to be acknowledged. My sister is probably one of the safest people I've ever met. She has 4 kiddos and is sheltering, and there is so much that she has taught me. She is clearly has 4 kids, so under the age of 6. So there's a lot going on for her a lot of the time. And there's so few times where she can just sit down and check in with her heart and think, where am I hurting? How do I begin to release this and honor this? And I think for her husband is truly someone that can hold space, but she also is so good about prayer and meditation and intentionally entering into that and holding those things out and saying, look, this is what's happening. Also reveal to me the other things I'm hurting around. And even, just a couple minutes a day to check in with self, I think can be extraordinarily helpful on that path to healing. Again, I think judging or comparing grief is harmful. And I do think it's easy to judge your own grief as it's coming up because it's uncomfortable. You don't want to feel that way. And it's almost like, well, if I did something differently, if I did something better, would it have turned out differently? And those are, almost certainly those are lies that we are hearing in our minds. But it is scary to be in pain and not to have control over fixing it immediately or having a solution. And so that is something that we do have to be brave with. I have to check in with myself so often. I actually bought myself a workbook on self-compassion because I would catch myself being so hard on myself and saying to myself, why can't I pull myself out of this depression today and just be that chipper, happy person that I want to be? I'm tired of who I am right now. This doesn't work. This doesn't fit. I hate it. And it must be that I'm just not strong enough. And I know that if a friend said that to me, I would say, there's a global pandemic underway and we're getting mixed messages and we don't know what's best all the time. There's so many uncertainties. It's something we never thought we would need tools for, personally, emotionally. We don't have any training for this. Of course you feel depleted and depressed. And if you felt happy-go-lucky, I would really be concerned actually about the way that you're thriving amidst a pandemic. Hopefully maybe somebody's doing that, but I think we're surviving. I think we're in survival mode, and to be hard on oneself for not being able to thrive right now is really tough, but also makes so much sense if you begin to think about it from the perspective of a friend sharing that kind of information with you. And that's why I'm so grateful for a couple friends that I do have where I can come to them with my pain and also my self-judgment. And they can say, of course you're mourning the loss of this thing. That was something that grounded you and helped you to feel like you were stable in these ways. And reminds me that I am human. I'm allowed to be human. I'm allowed to mess things up. I'm allowed to try different things right now because my old tools, going to yoga, going to sing with my friends, they are not something that I can utilize right now. And that's heartbreaking. That's heartbreaking. And to say that and to be able to sit with that, I feel like I'm just now starting to be not an acceptance of this being how it will always be, but I'm starting to accept that I do not have the things that I need right now to thrive and to feel good about myself. And that's really unfortunate. And I am learning to find new things right now to get me by and to help me. I think it's difficult, especially when you're sheltering in place with other people who have different ways of coping and different ways of self-soothing during this. It's hard to be gentle. It's hard to have that space for people, especially right now. But it is so worth it if you begin to practice being gentle with yourself and you begin to practice being gentle with the people around you when you hear them talking about what they have lost and what they are grieving, even if they're saying it in sort of code language, even if they're just extra tired, even if it's something they're not ready to face yet. And that is, for a lot of us, we're not ready to start naming our hurts, or maybe we can name one or two that don't feel quite as scary, but that might be where some of us are, and that's okay too. Another thing that I wanted to touch on briefly is that some things, I've seen a lot of this, not only in myself, but in people that I've been working with right now. And I do want to sort of sidestep for a moment to mention that I feel like I'm very privileged during this time to walk with so many people through pandemic within like a counseling system where I get to see a lot of really genuine reactions, a lot of fear. I think when I look at social media or I talk to people who maybe aren't ready to look at where they're hurting or struggling, it's difficult to remember that we're all in this together, because yes, there may be a lot of joys right now for some of us, and there may be some joys for many of us, but collectively we are still grieving the heaviness of having lost a lot of things. And whether or not that's been accepted and felt yet, that is a reality that we are all living in. And I think as a counselor, there is this really tremendous gift in being able to have the privilege to see other people's hurts and have a window into their soul and some of the things that they are discovering and learning and just trying to get through right now. And it's so difficult. And so I think that is something that gives me a little bit of perspective, where I feel just very honored to sit with that with people. And so backtracking to what I was talking about, one thing that's come up for me, and many of these people I've had the honor of sitting with, is that many of us have had past loss, past grief. Some of us, that's gone hand in hand with trauma. And during this time, I think for myself, especially at the beginning of everything that happened, as far as knowing we needed to shelter in place and that my job was going to change, all of the things that I did were going to change. First, there was some shock and disbelief, and I didn't feel the grief. And then the grief came, but it brought with it a lot of past grief, a lot of past losses, and some trauma that did manifest in dreams, in difficulty with finding ways to be grounded, and some panic feelings. And that is really normal when grief is compounded. If we've never had to sit with some of those losses, or if we've never had the privilege to sit with past losses, with someone that is safe. I mean, maybe we didn't have a safe space to go. Maybe we didn't know that's what we were supposed to do. I certainly didn't know that. During the time that I was experiencing some of the things that came up for me at the beginning of pandemic, and maybe it was a really sudden or scary loss that will resurface every time something else really scary comes up. And I just want to normalize that, and name it for someone that might not be able to see it themselves. If you have a child or an adolescent in your life who's suddenly really missing a grandmother who passed away, or really missing something big that doesn't seem like it is relevant right now, it is relevant right now because what we're in, that powerlessness that we feel, is highlighting those places in our life where we also felt powerless and perhaps didn't have the tools to grieve that time or work through that time appropriately, or maybe there's some unfinished business. And so experiencing those things is normal. It's difficult. It's so difficult. And for me, I certainly had to reach out to another licensed professional mental health worker, just to weed through some of those things. They can be really complex and really difficult. Also, I'm sorry if y'all hear that barking in the background. It's just my dog. One of the working at home issues is, even with a sound machine and all sorts of things to try to help make it more manageable, we're all running into these difficulties right now, or I assume many of us are running into these difficulties right now. But that being said, truly, again, not being hard on self for experiencing difficult things from your past that are coming up, and trying to be understanding of people around you who may also be experiencing similar things. This is really tough. This is tough work. I know it sounds nice when you can talk about it in a sequenced way, I guess similar to that article I was talking about earlier of like, be positive, like name your griefs. Like, it's really hard, because in naming your griefs, you have to admit that they are there, that they are hurting, and that they need tending to. And a lot of us don't have that energy right now, and it feels so overwhelming to think, oh, I have to dig into these things that are either resurfacing, or these new things that I've lost that I'm hurting about. It's difficult work, but I do see people really responding well to beginning to weed through it. And I myself see more, or experience more peace, experience more connection with the people that I am in contact with right now, or even with friendships over the phone. It's something that I truly believe is helpful. And self-awareness in general is so beautiful when walking through grief, when walking through loss. Knowing your patterns, starting to understand your patterns. How am I responding to this loss today? Does it feel more intense than the loss that I named last week? And why? And what does that mean? And if you start to see patterns in yourself, what a cool gift. That helps next time you experience those feelings, or once you see a pattern, there's a little bit more stability in experiencing and stepping into that pain or grief or the fears of depression or anxiety, because you remember what that pattern looks like. Okay, I'm anxious for this many days, and then I start to feel depressed, and then I start to gain some clarity. I mean, just something like that, where really anything you can find right now to help ground you and give you a sense of control, as long as it's not taking away the freedom of someone else, is a good thing. As I don't think that power and control is in any way a bad thing for us to have around. So many things are out of control right now. We do, as humans, need to feel like we're in control of something. And what are those things? And in the midst of grief, I may not be able to control that I'm hurting right now, but I can control writing that thing down, and I can control who I take that pain to and who I talk to that pain about. And so maybe part of it is even processing through our own pain in a way that gives us some groundedness. There are so many ways that I know you can also Google, like ways to get grounded. There are breathing techniques. There's doing yoga at home if you have the space or the means to get that. There's so many different therapists right now who may be more accessible because of telehealth, and I know a lot of people are offering sliding scale fees. I'm certainly doing that. Things that are more manageable for people right now because we are hurting. A lot of us are stressed out financially, and things have changed in that arena. And so even just in the midst of all of this pain and all of this heaviness, there are things that can bring us back to ourselves, back into a spiritual communion, back into connection with one another. And often the hardest answer can be the simplest too, like getting quiet and deciding to journal about what's hurting, what doesn't feel right, or deciding to talk to someone about that, or making the space to take a walk and actually be still for a moment and think through what's happening. These are difficult times, friends, and I never thought I would experience something like this. I'm struggling in my work. I'm struggling to stay focused, but I still show up, and I think part of this time of grieving is exhausting. It's been so good for me in recognizing some of my limits and saying, I can't take on more clients this particular day, or I need to take a break in the afternoons to do this thing for myself, or do I need to talk to a doctor about a medication that will help me get through this time, especially with all of our time on the screen. I mean, that's really tough for kiddos too. They're losing a lot of that human interaction and learning, and there's a lot of, for certain brains, especially those of us who are a little more creative, that can be really daunting and jolting. And I know I've talked to a lot of kiddos' parents and kiddos who are really struggling academically, either at the end of their school year or right now if they're doing summer school. And that is part of this whole thing, where there's not usually no reason to be struggling or to be hurting or to be grieving or to feel the loss of something. There is usually something worthy of examining. And yes, that does take intentionality. It takes time. It takes practice. It won't happen all at once. It is a practice. It's such a practice. It's why I tell people I'm in recovery from perfectionism, because it's something that I have to strive for every single day. And that especially comes out when I'm grieving. And in closing, I would really love to ask each of you a couple simple-ish questions that could be really hard. But if you examine your own life, your own inner life at this moment, do you know how you're feeling most of the time? For some of us, that can be really hard to identify what's actually happening for us. And then, do you notice any sort of harsh voice within yourself, even when someone's asking you, how are you today? And you say, I'm having a hard time, but it's okay, because I'm kind of jumping into silencing your own pain. And granted, some people do not have the space for that. Some people are very overwhelmed when you are honest with them about what's happening for you. And probably means they're not able to look at their own work yet in that arena. And it's uncomfortable, because if you're in pain and they haven't addressed their own pain, feels super overwhelming. So obviously, being mindful of who you are also open and genuine and honest with, if you are in need of comfort, is something to be aware of. But I would say, yeah, is there a voice that jumps in and says, well, you've been sad for a couple months now, you've got to get it together and be okay? Is there an internal voice that's saying that? And if it is, I would just invite you to try to listen to what your heart is saying, where you're bleeding internally, obviously metaphorically, but just emotionally, where are you hurting? And where can that be addressed in a way that will allow you some freedom from that heaviness? And I know that not all of us can do that alone. In fact, probably most of us can't do that alone. I mean, I've needed a therapist. Some of my depression gets really dark, and those things often emerge when I'm grieving. And it's taken me talking to mental health professionals and talking to a doctor about medications to feel like I'm in a place where I can actually lean into the depressed feelings, lean into the hurt, whatever's going on underneath that depression, just being with myself, allowing myself to be in that space. And then I would ask you, are you uncomfortable with the people around you, maybe in your household, maybe your friendships? Are you uncomfortable with them being in pain? And again, that's not necessarily bad. If it is, maybe you need to set a boundary or find other outlets for them, or ask them to find other outlets. We all have a topping off point of, how much we can hold for someone else. But often we're able to hold more if we've been taking care of our own pain and our own griefs. And so that may be something to think about if your tolerance for other people's pain is really, really low right now. That's okay. That's not any sort of judgment. But is there something you can do for you to help you come to terms with what's going on for you? Why are you so full? Is it a lot of emotion that you're holding on to that you could release so that you have more space for yourself and more for your kiddos or your friends or your colleagues or your partner? These are tough questions, and these are things that are hard to address in regular everyday life, and they may be even harder to address now. And so this is certainly not something that I would ask lightly or suggest lightly. I'm in the process of doing a lot of this work, and it is hard, and I mess up all the time. And that's, like I said, in recovery from perfectionism, I still strive, and I have to remind myself most days that it's okay to be tired. It's okay to not be able to be fully present at every moment. It's okay to need to numb out. I got into reading murder mystery novels. I don't know where that one came from. It's never been one of my past things that I've done. It's trying out new things to find ways to self-soothe and to be able to return to those things I'm grieving when I'm ready to return to them. And maybe you have to offer those things up to a friend or to God multiple times. It's kind of like, I don't know, I'm thinking another loss. I don't know why this popped into my head, but going through a breakup, you don't just have the breakup, cry, and then move on. For most of us will see a picture and it kind of sparks something internally and it's sad, or we'll hear about that person and grief comes back in. So grieving is also a practice, allowing that grief to flow through, allowing it to have its own timetable, and not letting other people diminish that for you. As far as you don't have to only be sad for a couple days or a couple hours. It's what your body tells you is when you're allowed to be done. And so I would invite you to think on those things, to maybe start working on some of those things. I so look forward to talking and discussion over our Zoom meetings and to hearing what everyone else has come up with. I'm doing my best to grieve in a healthy way during this time, but it's really tough, and I've made all sorts of mistakes along the way, self-judgment and not having space for others or myself, because I'm not checking in and taking care of myself. But again, that's okay to make mistakes, and we're all doing it, as well as trying to be okay. I'm trying to feel healthy and normal right now. With all of that, I believe that's most of what I had prepared today, and I am again so honored to be able to speak with you over this video, and then to be able to connect at a later time with you all. And I will be holding so many of you in my heart, and for those of you that I know, I hope to be able to see you in the coming months.
Hi, I'm Father Perry Mullins, the rector of St. Peter's Episcopal Church in McKinney, Texas. Whether we want to admit it right now or not, we're all grieving the loss of the life that we knew back before this pandemic began. I can tell you as a pastor, I am grieving. I'm grieving as I preach to a camera and an empty building Sunday after Sunday, grieving the community that gave healing to my soul and I know to so many others. I'm grieving as a parent, as I explain to my son why he can't go to school for a time, or why we can't go to a friend's house just to hang out. I am grieving, and I think you are too. And in the midst of grief, it's important to remember that we have to find creative ways to stay in community, to care for ourselves, and to let others care for us also. It's important to allow ourselves to grieve and to be sad when the time is right, but also to hold on to a deep hope. In 2014, my sister died. It's probably the hardest I've grieved in my entire life. And just weeks after she died, I was in church, up in front of my congregation, and it was time to proclaim the gospel. And I remember opening the Bible, my head still not completely in it, because I was in the midst of grief. And as I began to read, it was from John's prologue, and John chapter 1, verse 5 came up. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And I remember in that moment, standing there in front of all those people, tears welled up inside me. I'm not actually sure that any of them knew it was happening, but I knew. And it was everything I could do to get through the rest of that passage. But here's the thing. The tears that welled up inside me, they weren't tears of sadness at the loss of my sister. They were tears of joy, because I was proclaiming in the midst of my pain and brokenness that we believe in a God who loves us so much that he walked among us, that he died for us after suffering, and that on the third day he broke out of that dark tomb into that great morning light. We believe that the light shines in the darkest places and that the darkness cannot overcome it. That's a truth that wells up inside me to this day. No matter what we're facing, no matter what we're grieving, no matter what darkness we find ourselves in, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. Amen.
Thank you for attending our speaker series, Supporting Families Through COVID-19, presented by Episcopal Family Ministry. Join us for a question and answer session via Zoom with the speaker this Thursday at 6 p.m., Friday at 8:30 p.m., or Saturday at 9:30 a.m. Please register for these calls with the link provided. The Episcopal Churches of Collin County are praying for you and your families.